Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone this morning to Human Rights Watch's World Report 2022 launch. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. I'm Yasmin Ahmed, the UK Director for Human Rights Watch, and I'm here, very happily here with Ken Roth, Human Rights Watch's long-time Executive Director. Before we get started on to the main event, I'd like to just go through a few housekeeping things with you. So this press conference is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. A video link will be available afterwards. We have simultaneous interpretation available in Arabic, French, Spanish, and international sign language, which we're very proud of. You should have a button at the bottom of your screen where you can select which language you would like to hear. Due to technical limitations, the live stream and video link will only be available in English. So if you would like a recording in any other languages, we suggest you choose that language and record it yourself. We also have experts who can provide interviews in other languages and would be happy to make them available to you. I'm now going to hand over the floor to Ken Roth in just one moment. When he is done speaking, we will take questions. Please put any questions that you have in the Q&A box. You will see that there's both a Q&A box and a chat box at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A box. We would also be really grateful if you would identify yourself in any questions that you do ask. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Ken Roth.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. Good morning, everybody. Today it is my pleasure to present Human Rights Watch's 32nd annual World Report. Like every year, this report surveys human rights developments over the past year. This year we have chapters on some 100 countries. As we mentioned, in a moment, I'll be happy to answer your questions on these developments. But what I'd first like to do is to highlight this year's overarching theme as reflected in the report's introduction. Now, the conventional wisdom these days is that autocracy is ascendant, that democracy is on the decline. But as we surveyed the world over the past year, we've seen that the reality is much more complex. In places like Myanmar, Thailand, Sudan, Uganda, Russia, Belarus, Poland, Cuba, and Nicaragua, we have recently seen a public outpouring of support for democracy. People have taken to the streets to demand an end to autocratic rule, even at the risk of being arrested or shot. Needless to say, there are few rallies for autocratic rule. But the problem for autocrats goes even deeper than that. In some countries that retain at least a semblance of democratic elections, despite the leaders' autocratic tendencies, opposition political parties have begun to paper over their policy differences to build broad alliances in pursuit of their common interest in ousting their ruler. Such coalitions have succeeded in removing over the past year Czech Prime Minister Babiš and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Today, they are challenging Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán and Turkish President Erdogan. And a similar coalition in the United States could be said to have been behind the selection of Joe Biden as the candidate to run against Donald Trump. Now, as established autocrats can no longer rely on subtly manipulated elections to preserve their power, a growing number of autocrats are resorting to electoral charades that guarantee victory, but confer none of the legitimacy of an election. And we've seen these kinds of zombie elections in Hong Kong, Nicaragua, Belarus, Russia, Uganda, Iran, and elsewhere. Now, one could try to portray these electoral farces as autocratic assertions of power. But in fact, they are acts of desperation. They are last resort measures for autocrats who would have preferred the legitimacy that comes with even a compromised election. But these autocrats have lost any prospect of public support. so they have to resort to these totally sham elections. If you stand in the shoes of the autocrats, all of these developments spell trouble. Now, that should hardly be surprising. Autocrats claim to deliver better results than Democrats, but they usually deliver mainly for themselves. Despite their fanciful rhetoric of serving the people, despite their efforts to change the subject by demonizing minorities or immigrants, autocrats invariably serve themselves and the generals and cronies who back them. The COVID-19 pandemic illustrated this problem well. Beginning with China at the time of the Wuhan outbreak, many autocratic leaders suppressed information that they found to be politically costly, even at the expense of public health. Some autocratic leaders even used the pandemic as a pretext to suppress opposition rallies. Ultimately, people saw through that. But we should not be complacent. We must recognize that autocrats have been maintaining power not only because they've been trying to divert attention from their self-serving rule, they also have benefited from the failings of democratic leaders. Today's challenges are big: the climate crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, poverty and inequality, racial injustice, the threats from modern technology. But today's democratic leaders are too often mired in short-term partisan battles to address these big problems effectively. Yes, democratic leaders are more answerable to their people, but they have not risen to the occasion. They must ensure that democracy delivers on its promised dividends. Being the so-called least bad system of governance, because the electorate can vote the government out, may not be enough if public despair at democratic leaders' failure to meet today's challenges leads to public indifference about democracy. The defense of human rights requires not only curbing autocratic repression, but also improving democratic leadership. Otherwise, democratic leaders risk fueling the frustration and despair that would give the autocrats a second chance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken. I'm sure, like myself, that was incredibly interesting and thought-provoking for everyone on this call and those that have had the chance to read the report and the essay. So now we are going to open it up to questions. So if you have a question, as we had mentioned before, please do put it in the Q&A. And if you can identify yourself, that would be wonderful. So I'll just wait a moment to see if anyone has any questions. And in the interim, Ken, I may ask you a question if you don't mind myself, just to get started. The first question I have for you, Ken, is do you think democratic governments and states should be doing more? And if so, what should that be?
Yeah, obviously, yes, they should be doing more. In a sense, the major point of this thesis is that, it's not simply that autocrats are failing. I think that the public is seeing that more and more. But we have to recognize that democratic leaders are not doing a great job themselves. And, one of the big problems is that in most democracies today, there are, coalitions or narrow majorities that limit the scope for action. Particularly for the kind of big action that's required to address, for example, climate change or to deal effectively with the pandemic. And so there are constraints on democratic leaders. We have to recognize that. But what we really are calling for is the kind of the visionary rhetoric, the genuine leadership that, despite these constraints of democracy, these inevitable and in many ways valid, appropriate constraints, we need leaders who can move the public and move their political allies forward in the big steps that are required to address these big challenges. And so, we really are looking for that kind of visionary leadership. In a sense, anybody could provide that, but sadly, nobody seems to be providing it today. Even, those leaders who like to be known for their rhetoric, like to be known for their ability to see the big picture, they're not providing that leadership. They too are mired in this kind of short-term incremental approach. And that's just not meeting the challenges of the day. That's not rising to the occasion. So we really are issuing an urgent call to democratic leaders to stand up, not simply because these are global problems that need to be addressed, but also because without that kind of leadership, we are not going to see democracy prevailing in this long-term contest with autocracy.
Thank you, Ken. I have a question now from Margaret Evans from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Ken, can you please comment more specifically on your findings in Canada with specific reference to climate change and the country's failure to repatriate citizens being held in the camps in northeast Syria?
Okay, with respect to climate change, obviously Canada is a major petroleum producer, and in that sense is a is a major contributor to the problem of climate change. And this is a classic case of the Trudeau government facing conflicting pressures, from the Western states that are producing, provinces that are producing the oil, and a broader public that is deeply concerned about climate change, and which is having a particular effect on the Indigenous population in the North, which is finding their traditional livelihood harmed, their access to basic necessities limited. So this is precisely where a leader like Mr. Trudeau should be able to provide the visionary leadership that is required and move beyond the narrower political constraints that he faces. And that's the kind of leadership they were calling for really across the world's major democracies. Now, with respect to Canadian citizens in northeastern Syria, this is a problem that is facing a number of Western governments. There are many Western citizens who are stuck in camps, basically enclosed prisons in northern eastern Syria. What they all have in common is that they're mostly women and children. And the women were married to an Islamic State fighter. And the children are either pre-existing children or the child of the fighter. The fighters tend to be in separate custody. And that's a separate problem, that their prosecutions are often not fair or not proceeding at all. But these women and children are not accused of anything, other than maybe a bad choice of a partner. And you can't even talk about a child choosing their parent. But these are citizens who have done nothing wrong. They're not accused of having done anything wrong other than having bad judgment, but not having committed a crime. And many Western countries, including Canada, would just prefer to leave them there, out of sight, out of mind. But these are their citizens, and that's wrong. They should be repatriated. If there is a crime that they're accused of, fine, charge them and prosecute them. But so far, nobody's being charged. They're just being punished by being left there in these desolate, dangerous camps in northeastern Syria. And so we've called on not simply Canada, but many Western countries that are allowing their citizens to languish there to change this cruel and inhumane approach to their own people.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you again, Margaret, for that question. We now have a question from Nina Tegerty, and I think it's a really important question, and certainly I know from you, Ken, the one that we've been thinking about. What more can the international community do to support activists and movements, democratic coalitions in autocratic countries?
That's a very important question, because while most Western governments today nominally say that they support human rights, they often condition that in practice by their interest in what they view as stability or fighting terrorism or controlling migration or what have you. And maybe a perfect illustration of that is what's going on in Sudan today, because the Sudanese people have made absolutely clear what they want. They want a democratic transition, and they epitomize a people that is demonstrating their desire for change at great risk to their lives, because the Sudanese security forces have periodically shot and killed demonstrators. But the Western response, and here I think the US government is foremost at risk because they've been a major player in Sudan. The Western response has been to kind of work gradually with the military and to keep a real distance from the people of Sudan, who are the drivers of change. And it's as if the West, wants a military managed transition, which is actually the last thing that people of Sudan want, because they saw what a military managed transition looks like next door in Egypt. And it led to the most brutal dictatorship that Egypt has seen in modern history. They don't want that, facade, that they wanted genuine progress. And that requires much more firmly standing with the people. And it doesn't mean, sending money or whatever. That's at this point not the issue. The people are doing very well coming to the streets. It means, finding ways to publicly stand with, to publicly identify with the movement for change, and to step away from this reflexive, instinctual view that we got to stick with the military, we got to stick with the, the powers that be, because that's the route to stability. Because we've seen so often that that's a route to, at best, superficial change, and often just to a perpetuation of the status quo.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you again, Nina, for your question. We now have a question from Pierre Husky from France Interradio. And again, another question that we internally have been thinking about. Where do the US stand, Ken, in this rather optimistic view of the state of democracy? Is US democracy in danger, as past American commentators have recently stated? And what should be done about it?
Well, sadly, Pierre, I think the answer is yes, US democracy is very much threatened. We saw that a year ago, January 6th, when the Capitol was invaded by a mob that was incited by Trump. But that was in many ways a kind of a ham-fisted, amateurish attempt to overthrow an election that Trump had lost. What I fear now is that at least Trump's allies, if not Trump himself, have learned the lessons and are pursuing a much more sophisticated effort to ensure victory, regardless of what the voters want, in 2024. And there are different elements to this, only part of which is addressed by the legislation in Congress right now, which in any event is going to have a hard time getting passed, given the difficulty of getting through the Senate with the filibuster. But the problem is, in part, voter suppression. The Republicans have calculated that a lesser voter turnout works better for them. Now, that's a debatable proposition. There's been much academic study of this, which argues both ways. But nonetheless, the strategy is to make it more difficult for people to vote, figuring that makes it in particular harder for racial and ethnic minorities to vote. So that is, one part of the problem. But in many ways, the almost more dire effort underway, which is getting less attention, is an effort to address the electoral machinery. Because if you go back to 2020, what stopped the Trump effort to steal the election was actually, ordinary local electoral officials, many of whom were Republican, but who just did the right thing. They were public servants, they counted the votes, and they just declared who won. Simple, There is now a concerted effort to replace those objective officials with highly partisan ones. And the fear is that in 2024, should it appear that, if Trump runs again, should it appear that Trump is losing the popular vote in various swing states, that these local electoral officials will be called in to simply declare Trump the victor, regardless of what the voters said. That is a fundamental threat to democracy. That would turn the United States into a dictatorship. And that is a real threat right now, which deserves attention.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Pierre, for your question. I have now two questions from Sonia Sanchez from ARA newspaper in Barcelona. The first question, Ken, is, besides electoral charades, have autocratic regimes increased their repression and violence in 2021? Which of them have the worst record in this past year, including according to our HRW survey? That's the first question. The second question is, the Capitol assault was a big threat for democracy in the USA. One of the so-called leaders of the democratic world, how did it affect democracy globally?
Okay, well, in terms of where was repression severe? And I'm not going to answer this in terms of what was the worst, because we don't really do those sorts of comparisons. But let me just talk about what I'm worried about right now. There are places where the potential for large-scale violence and large-scale loss of life is quite acute. Let me begin with Afghanistan, which is facing a dual threat. On the one hand, the Taliban takeover with its utter intolerance for dissent, its disrespect for the rights of women. But Afghanistan is also facing massive potential loss of life because of the economic situation. And that economic situation is in large part due to a liquidity crisis, a lack of physical currency due to the sanctions imposed by the US government and others. And there is an urgent need to address that liquidity crisis, to allow the Afghan central bank access to its funds so it can purchase literally dollar bills, as well as acquire Afghani currency, the local currency, so that people will have the cash to go to the markets and buy food. Right now, there is food in the markets. People don't have the literal cash to get it. So, yes, it's partly a matter of humanitarian aid. There should be a way to get aid to teachers, to healthcare workers, directly or through the UN or through NGOs without funding the Taliban. But this fundamental liquidity crisis risks large-scale starvation in the midst of the winter. So that needs to be addressed. I also want to highlight two other places. One would be Myanmar, where we've seen that as the junta is backed further into a corner, as it recognizes that the population utterly doesn't accept the coup of a year ago. It's taken more and more to shooting demonstrators. There are some 1,400, more than 1,400 who have been killed so far. And my fear is that that could accelerate as the military's back is against the wall, because it's so far, it has shown no sign of relenting, no sign of recognizing reality that the people of Myanmar want democracy. They don't want military rule. So that's a real flashpoint. And then the other final one I'll highlight for now is Tigray in Ethiopia. Where, for the moment, the fighting seems to have died down, although there are these periodic reports just recently of airstrikes hitting refugee camps and killing civilians. But again, the big threat there is the Ethiopian government's blockade of humanitarian assistance that is desperately needed by millions of people in the Tigray region. And this is a classic case of collective punishment. This is not punishing Tigrayan military forces. This is punishing the people, the ethnic people of Tigray. And there's an urgent need for pressure on the government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed to relent, to allow humanitarian aid to flow. The aid is there, the UN is ready to provide it, the Ethiopian government is blocking it. So those are three hotspots that I would highlight. There was another question. Yasmin, you're going to have to remind me what Sonya's other question was.
Yeah, absolutely. The Capitol assault was a big threat for democracy in the USA. Yes. So that was the question.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, it obviously was. And, I think we already had problems with Trump because as president, he was embracing every friendly autocrat under the sun. While Human Rights Watch continues to have problems with the Biden administration's selective approach to the defense of human rights, at least you can say that Biden has stopped embracing all of these friendly autocrats. He's embracing only a handful now. So that's been progress. But apart from that, Trump, his ongoing failure to recognize his electoral loss. I mean, even yesterday he walked out of an interview where he was being questioned about this. It just shows a lack of respect for the most basic premise of democracy, which is you let the voters decide and you go with what they decide. And when you have, the leader of a country who doesn't recognize that reality, it just invites others to do the same. And I think we're seeing the echoes of that today, most prominently in Brazil, where President Bolsonaro, way down in the polls, fearful of a loss in the forthcoming election, is also already talking about electoral fraud before the voters have even voted. And now fortunately, Brazil has strong institutions of checks and balances against executive power, which is what saved the United States. It was the independent media, independent activists, independent judges, independent legislatures, and most important, a federal system that had independent local election officials that saved the 2020 elections. Brazil has all of that as well. And so I remain confident that Brazil's democracy is strong enough to resist Bolsonaro's Trump-like effort to undermine it. But this is an echo of Trump. Bolsonaro is trying to be, a mini Trump. Let me just, I just got a flash of news on my screen from one of our colleagues, but there has been a trial that I think many of you know that has been taking place in Koblenz, Germany. This is a trial of the first trial of Syrian government torture. And I don't have the details other than that there was just a guilty verdict that was rendered. And this is really historic because, while Russia, sometimes aided by China, has blocked efforts to send the Syrian atrocities to the International Criminal Court, there still is a very important alternative, which is using national jurisdictions using the concept of universal jurisdiction, the idea that war crimes, mass atrocities can be tried in any viable forum. And the German government proceeded with that. They brought this important torture trial, which just came to the conclusion, and there's been a guilty. So I just wanted to make that announcement because it just popped up on my screen from my colleague. Human Rights Watch, I should say, has been in the courtroom throughout. Our evidence of these atrocities played a role in the prosecution. Has been a very big priority for us.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for addressing that update. And thank you again, Sonia, for your question. I now have a question from Moritz Ellison from the German news agency EPD. To what extent did autocratic but also democratic governments use the COVID pandemic to restrict human rights and freedom of expression? Has the pandemic fostered human rights violations?
Sadly, the pandemic has been used by various autocrats and autocratically inclined leaders to further their political views. Sometimes this was overt. It's like the Russian government or the Ugandan government, blocking opposition rallies, using COVID as a pretext, all the while allowing pro-government rallies to take place. This was pretty transparent manipulation, transparent usage of this pretext. But more fundamentally, there were many governments that not simply downplayed the pandemic, but censored criticism of their response to the pandemic. And you see examples of this in places like Egypt or India, where criticism was seen as damaging to the government. The government was doing a poor job of responding to the pandemic. And so doctors who would say something would be silenced, they'd be censored. And this is a disaster. Public Health 101 says that the best way to address a pandemic is to allow the free flow of information, so you learn about the threat as it emerges, and free debate about the best way to respond. And when governments put their own political interests ahead of the public's, that's the pandemic's best friend. And of course, the best illustration of this was what happened in Wuhan, China, at the outset of the pandemic. Because for the first 3 weeks in January 2020, the Chinese government suppressed evidence that the virus was transmitting human to human. They were pretending that all of the cases led directly to the Wuhan market, which was not the case. And that suppression of that basic fact went so far as forcing healthcare workers in Wuhan not to put on personal protective equipment because that would undermine the government's cover story. So they were actually willing to sacrifice their healthcare workers in order to maintain a fiction. And during these 3 weeks of lies, literally millions of people passed through or fled Wuhan. And that's how the virus went global. That's how we have a pandemic. So this is a perfect illustration of the disaster that can ensue from the censorship of public health information. And this is, of course, part of why the Chinese government is so desperate to avoid independent inquiry into the origins of the virus, leaving alone, whether the virus came from emerged naturally or from the Wuhan lab. They don't want this deadly 3-week censorship to be highlighted.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Moritz, again for that question. I now have a question from Nicola Glass, who's a freelance journalist focused on Southeast Asia. The reactions of the international community, in particular the UN Security Council, on the atrocities and crimes against humanity committed by the military junta in Myanmar have been insufficient so far, to put it mildly. What has to be done to launch a global arms embargo against Myanmar's military rulers?
Well, the difficulty with a global arms embargo is that it would require action by the United Nations Security Council. Human Rights Watch would love to see that action. We called for it. It's not going to happen because Russia and China are threatening to use their vetoes. And this has been a pervasive problem. It's, I mentioned a moment ago, it's part of the problem in Syria. The UN Security Council has basically ceased to be an effective vehicle for addressing global challenges of this sort because of this misuse of the veto. Partly just to protect allies. The US government does that to protect Israel. But partly in the case of Russia and China, because they are opposed to the UN human rights system in general. They are trying to undermine international enforcement of human rights because they fear that system will be turned on their own repression. And so in order to spare themselves critical scrutiny, they're willing to sacrifice global human rights in the system that defends the people around the world from repression. Now, in the case of Myanmar, though, that's not the end of the story because individual countries still can act. And in part, it's an arms embargo. I mean, anybody can say, I'm not going to sell arms to the Myanmar junta anymore because they're using those arms to kill demonstrators. I mean, I would hope every decent government would do that. But what I see is the next big step is to try to cut off the funds that the junta is using to pay for its repression. And we should recognize that steps have been taken along these lines already. A number of governments have imposed not only targeted sanctions on the individual leaders of the junta, but also perhaps most important so far, on the two big military conglomerates that control much of the Myanmar economy and have been a major source of revenue for the junta. So today, what's left? Today, the biggest source of revenue is from the gas operations, the petroleum operations offshore that are run principally by the French petroleum company Total and the US petroleum company Chevron. And these are pumping vast sums of funds to the junta that is using those funds to kill people. That should stop. And the best way to stop is not necessarily to turn off the gas, but rather to divert the revenue from that gas to an escrow fund, holding it in escrow for the Myanmar people when they have decent government, but depriving it from the junta now. And the resistance to that is, frankly, French President Macron and US President Biden. That's where the responsibility lies. They are more interested in their national commercial interests than in stopping the killing in Myanmar. We have to recognize that that's the reality and put pressure on Macron and Biden to turn off the gas revenue as the best way to stop the killing and detention of pro-democracy protesters.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Nicola, for that question. We now have a question via YouTube from Kisanet Hale Mola, and she asks, Ken, what do you think about the functions of the UN Security Council, which you've mentioned in a few of your answers, and how is it being used to embolden dictatorial leaders instead of its main stand, and what can be done to solve this?
Well, I mean, as I've mentioned, the UN Security Council is stymied these days because of the veto. And principally Russia and China, although sometimes the United States, is using their veto to prevent the Security Council from addressing the kinds of major security threats that it should be addressing. So, because Security Council reform is extremely difficult, it's not going to happen without the consent of the Security Council members, and they don't seem inclined to provide that consent. I think we are stuck for the moment with a dysfunctional Security Council. Pressure should certainly be put on the veto-wielding countries not to abuse their veto, but that is not on the short-term horizon. And so we have to look at alternatives. Now, one alternative is obviously UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He has a very important moral platform that he could be using. But the Secretary General, frankly, has been, when he speaks about human rights, tends to speak in broad generalities. I favor women's rights. I favor minority rights. He never mentions countries, or rarely mentions countries. And so as a result, nobody feels the heat and nobody changes. These are kind of meaningless general statements. Now, that's begun to change now that he has a second term. He started to talk about certain easier countries. But if you look at sort of the big threats, for example, the Chinese government's mass persecution of Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, Guterres is silent. He won't talk about it. And this is an extraordinary moral failure. Now, one real test for the Secretary General will be the Beijing Olympics. There's a growing diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics, but amazingly, Guterres plans to go. So now the question is, okay, you're going to go and help Beijing sports wash its repression. What are you going to do to highlight that repression? Now, even Ban Ki-moon found a way to speak about Putin's assault on LGBT rights before the Sochi Olympics. And Ban Ki-moon is not exactly known as this, outspoken, courageous Secretary General, but he was able to take on a superpower. Let's see what Guterres can do. I hope that he doesn't walk into Beijing with the same silence about Beijing's repression. Let me just make one other point, which is that the UN Human Rights Council has frankly emerged as by far and away the most important multilateral institution within the UN. And while Human Rights Watch is hardly happy with the membership, the regions that are proposing members are now gaming the system. They're supposed to put forward competitive slates, so the worst, most abusive members can be voted off. Virtually every region now is putting forward so-called closed slates, only the same number of candidates as openings, basically leaving no choice. And that's how you get, governments like Eritrea, or for that matter, Cuba or China or Russia. That's how they get on the Human Rights Council. So you have to look to the governments of the world for this problem, but nonetheless, the Human Rights Council regularly rises to the occasion. And if you look over the last year, they, even in a contested situation like Ethiopia, they imposed a very strong investigative and monitoring mechanism. Despite the vehement efforts by Ethiopia to block that. There's been similar action on Afghanistan, on Myanmar, on a lot of the big problems. So the Human Rights Council continues to be an effective vehicle. The one big failure this year was on Yemen, which for the 4 prior years had a very strong investigative and monitoring mechanism. But this year, the Saudi government, working behind the scenes, literally using bribery and threats, was able to get that investigative mechanism lifted. So Human Rights Watch has called on the UN General Assembly to step in. Now, the General Assembly being every UN member, it's a large, unwieldy place. It's a difficult place to operate. But we shouldn't forget about it. This happened once before where when the UN Security Council blocked access to the International Criminal Court for Syria, the General Assembly stepped in and created what was known as the IIIM, the International Independent Investigative Mechanism for Syria. And that was part of why we got the Koblenz trial just now. It's time for the General Assembly to step in again on Yemen and reinstitute the investigative mechanism that the Human Rights Council under Saudi influence just lifted.
Thanks, Ken. And I will just do a quick cheeky promotion of our Twitter space conversation that yourself and myself, our Deputy Director of the Africa Division, Ida Sawyer, and Hugh Tomlinson, our Director of the Europe and Central Asia Division, we will all be on Twitter space at 12 o'clock p.m. CEE time, or that will be 11 a.m. UK time. So to join us and hear more about some of the issues that we've been discussing around the Olympics, around the Koblenz trial, and so much more that we've been talking about today. So please do join us at 12 o'clock CET time today on Twitter Space. I'll go back to the questions now, and thank you to Kissanet for that question. It was very much appreciated. Ken, we now have a question from Rabinath Atata, and she is from the African Radio of the South African Broadcasting Corporation, so Channel Africa Radio of the South African Broadcasting Corporation. And she asked, "Dear Ken, can you highlight some of the major concerns for the African region with examples of countries of most concern?" That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, well, no, thank you for that question. I mean, I've already talked a bit about Tigray, which I have to say is at the top of our list right now. We are, frankly, also concerned about the state of democracy in Africa, and there have been, coups this year in Mali, Chad, Guinea, Tunisia, and the African Union tends to be better at responding to overt coups than it is at general repression. But that, there's that significant backsliding on democracy that is of great worry. Even when there's not an overt coup, if you look at the election that took place in Uganda, I mean, that is an illustration of the kind of zombie election that I talked about. Museveni, the president, was facing a very serious challenge by Bobby Wine, a singer and rapper who had turned into a very effective and charismatic politician. And this, young challenger was such a worry to Museveni that he literally, had his security forces shooting at people who would go to Bobby Wine rallies, all the while allowing his rallies to take place. And again, this was a case where, the pandemic was often used as a pretext. But, the result, I mean, nobody has confidence in the results of that election. That was a classic electoral charade, which Museveni just declared himself the victor of, and used force to enforce that. So, I mean, that sets a horrible example. And sadly, that's not the kind of situation that the African Union has been good at addressing. I want to, there's obviously much we could talk about, but I do want to highlight the situation in Cameroon, because I think it's just so often neglected. It doesn't get onto the radar screen of much of the world. But in the, the Anglophone regions of Cameroon, there has been a very ugly war going on with, both the insurgents and the government committing atrocities. Much of it centered around schools, where, schools that are teaching in English are seen as somehow a threat by the government, but also government officials are being attacked by the insurgents. So the situation there is one that I do want to highlight as a major problem. I don't want to, people so often look at Africa and say it's all bad news. And I want to stress two examples of good news, because if you look around the world and say, well, where was there a positive transition of government? Not a, Trump-like resisting every step of the way transition, but, where did the loser do the right thing and admit that they lost? Well, two of those cases were in Africa, in Malawi and Zambia. I should also highlight, I think Chile and Honduras are two other important examples of that. But the two African cases, I think, set a very important example to show that, you don't need to be a rich Western democracy to do the right thing, and to recognize that it should be the voters who decide. And when the voters decide against you, you accept that verdict and you go home and you congratulate the winner. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. I want to bring us back, in fact, to the Koblenz trial. And obviously you haven't had a chance because it's only just broken while we've actually been live. But I do want to talk it because it does bring some of the strings together of the inaction of, and inability of the Security Council and other kind of international fora to deal with justice and accountability in the context of human rights violations. And I would like you just potentially just to talk to us a little bit about what you see as the significance of this verdict, without obviously having seen the details of it, but the fact that someone has been found guilty in the context of and the context of accountability, not just in Syria, but in Syria and elsewhere, and what you see is the significance of this.
Well, I mean, just a word on the Koblenz trial. I don't have details, so I apologize for that. But in essence, my understanding is that there was a guilty verdict against the security official who was on trial. That the person was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life in prison. So that's a big deal. The torture and murder in custody that he was convicted of was a key part of the modus operandi of the Assad government in Syria. The Assad government has clung to power basically through a war crime strategy. This has been one of the ugliest wars that I've ever seen. People, routinely were detained, held in horrendous conditions, tortured, and routinely executed. We have no idea the numbers. But, we've seen, for example, the so-called Caesar photos that, thousands upon thousands of people were executed. Beyond that, the Syrian government, dropped so-called barrel bombs, indiscriminate bombs on civilian population in opposition-held areas. With Russian help, the Russians and Syrians targeted hospitals, schools, markets, apartment buildings to basically make life unlivable in opposition-held areas. And they did sieges where they would surround an entire area and basically starve people into submission. Then occasionally they would use chemical weapons. So this is, completely a war crime strategy. And because of the Russian and Chinese vetoes, the UN Security Council was unable to send these atrocities for prosecution by the International Criminal Court, which is the logical place. So in that situation where the natural international institution of justice is unavailable, we don't give up. And that's why we went to the UN General Assembly to circumvent the Security Council veto and got it to establish this IIIM, which is basically a prosecutor without a court. And she has been putting together evidence and cases against officials so that when a national prosecutor gets a hold of a Syrian official, as happened in Germany, they can turn to the IIIM for help. Because no national prosecutor on his or her own, it has all the information about Syria. But the IIIM sitting in Geneva has all of this. And this has made national prosecutions possible. And so Germany is very much at the forefront of this, but other governments are joining on as well, using this concept of universal jurisdiction, the idea that certain crimes are so heinous, torture, war crimes, crimes against humanity, that they can be prosecuted in any national court as well. And that is the way we are gradually beginning to break the impunity that has permitted Assad and his cronies to pursue this awful, inhuman war crime strategy in Syria.
Thank you, Ken. Very much appreciated. I think we're now getting close to the hour, and I want to thank everyone on the call, all those journalists and all the other people who've joined us. We very much appreciate it. You are very much part of our community, and our work relies on your work, and we hope that our work can also inform your work. Ken, I want to just ask you, sort of as we wrap up now, obviously the rise of authoritarianism is the biggest existential threat that we really face going forward. And I think we would all really appreciate your final thoughts about, tying all of this together, where to from here, and what you think needs to be done, and any final reflections that you have.
Well, I think the one thing we haven't talked about, which I should stress for a moment, is that, in this global contest between democracy and autocracy, we've discussed the inherent failings of autocrats, their tendency to serve themselves rather than their people. We've talked about the difficulty of democratic leaders delivering on some of the big global challenges, which is impeding the fight against autocracy. But the other dimension of this that we haven't discussed as much is the need for a more principled approach to the defense of human rights on the part of democratic leaders. And we're all happy that the US government is now led by somebody who is no longer embracing every friendly autocrat under the sun. The US government has rejoined the UN Human Rights Council. But that hasn't been enough. When Biden came into office, he said that human rights would be central to his foreign policy. Most other Western governments have a similar pretense. But then you begin to look at the reality. And while they're good at promoting human rights in relatively easy places when there's not a lot at stake, there are still big human rights violators that benefit from a double standard. And so if you look at Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, India, these are all governments with serious human rights problems that are largely getting a pass. They continue to benefit from arms sales, from military aid, from friendly summits, embraces of Western leaders, despite their abuse. We saw a ridiculous example of this when President Macron of France welcomed President Sisi of Egypt, literally rolled out the red carpet and gave him the Légion d'honneur, the highest honor in France, because of course, Sisi is a major purchaser of French arms. We've seen this, with Biden, who, as I said, claims to be guided by human rights, but is continuing massive military assistance to Egypt. There was like a tiny part of it that was conditioned this year. Most goes forward. With Saudi Arabia, he says he's not selling offensive arms, but continuing selling a lot of arms despite Saudi bombing indiscriminately in Yemen. During the Israeli bombardment in Gaza, including of these big apartment buildings, Biden didn't say a word about human rights. Very little discussion about what's happening with the rise of Hindu nationalism and the attacks on Muslims in India, because India is seen as an important partner in the contest with China. People notice these inconsistencies. And if the defense of human rights is seen as something that is done when it's only convenient, there's not much of a cost to it, that undermines the defense of human rights. And so I think we have to recognize that for democracy to prevail in this contest with autocracy, we need not only better governance at home, but also more consistent support for human rights abroad, even when it's not easy, even when the abuser is a government that is friendly to Western nations.
Thank you so much, Ken. And I look forward to continuing the discussion at 12 o'clock CEE time on Twitter Space. But thank you very much. We very much appreciate your comments, your essay, and I do hope that our World Report 2022 will be informative and useful for all those on the call and more broadly. Just want to reiterate that if anyone on the call wants to speak to a country expert from Human Rights Watch, they can do so and just email. The email is in the chat and it's hrwpress@hrw.org. That's hrwpress@hrw.org. All of our experts will be very happy to discuss with you. But thank you very much. Thanks to all of those who have joined this morning. And we look forward to continuing our work and continuing the conversation. So thank you very much.